Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kent Lassman. I'm the president here at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and I'm very excited to talk to you today with a friend who's in town from the School of Law, Loyola. Professor Adam Crepelle has produced a new book that we have right here. We're going to talk about Becoming Nations Again, and there is a lot packed in here, starting with history that you don't know and should, all the way through the regulatory implications of how law works in America, particularly on native lands, reservations and other native lands. In order to get us started, I'm going to simply ask what might be the easiest or most difficult question of the day. And Adam, why did you write? Why did you put so much blood, sweat, and tears, so much time and energy into a book? To what end? What is your purpose here? What do you want us to take away?
The purpose I'd like people to take away is basically tribes are governments. That's it. People often assume tribes are racial groups or another minority when in fact they're the original American sovereign. And the unique treatment Indian tribes receive is not some special racial privilege as a result of tribal sovereignty, their special sovereign status.
Let's start with that. I told you the other day, I was excited. I started to get excited as I got into the book about how much history I didn't know. So you said tribes are governments. What did government look like here before contact with first European explorers and then settlers and then colonizers? What did it look like in the Americas or in North America or in what is now the United States of America vis-a-vis the question of government? How were we governed here?
Sure, yeah. So the original American government, everybody thinks Indians are just wandering around chasing buffalo and picking berries until Europeans showed up, when in fact they actually had governments like everybody else. There's vastly different cultures. If you live in the Southwest, you have different needs and different climate issues than if you do in like the Northeast, for example. So government varied dependent on natural resources and climate. But it's safe to say all tribes would have developed laws. Murdering would have been bad everywhere. Nobody wants to get murdered, so all tribes would have prohibited things like that. Likewise, all tribes would have enforced contracts, and all tribes, contrary to the stereotype, actually protected private property rights. If you planted corn, you don't want somebody else coming take the corn that you've planted. So there had to be some mechanism to ensure that you could reap the benefits of the efforts you put into the land. So all tribes had things like that. And perhaps the best example of a pre-contact North American society that was big is Cahokia. From about 1,000 to 1,300 of the Common Era, it was one of the largest cities in the world. It would have been bigger than London and Paris at the time.
And help situate us. We're talking here now near or opposite modern-day St. Louis?
Yes, sir.
So what sort of civilization produced this city?
Yeah, so there's no written record, so we have to go largely off of archaeological evidence. But what we know is they built structures that were bigger than the Egyptians' pyramids. You don't see that in the history books. And one of the interesting things is whenever they're pushing for Indian Removal Act, they discovered, the Europeans or Americans discovered this and decided to sweep this under the rug because the idea that Indians were wandering savages that needed to be civilized doesn't jive with this great civilization in the middle of the country. But we know they had a government. We know it had to be sophisticated because they did incredible logistical feats, like tribe building a pyramid with no cranes, no horses, no none of that, just Stone Age tools. And they had zone cities, it looks like. And like for one example, in the Grand Plaza at Cahokia, there were 2,000 deer killed at a single feast. So the logistics to harvest 2,000 deer at one time, they weren't farmed. So the planning and stuff it would have taken to pulling that off is significant. Moreover, they engaged in long-distance trade. So shark's teeth from the Pacific Ocean are found there. Shark teeth from the Atlantic are found there. And they drank lots of caffeine. Yaupan's the only source of indigenous caffeine in North America, and it only grows along the southeastern U.S. So, and remember, there's no horses. So somebody has to catch, for example, the shark in San Diego, take out its teeth. Somebody has to carry it over the Rocky Mountains on foot, and then get to Cahokia. So there's incredible logistics that go into doing something like this.
And you're emphasizing here logistics across space, but the mound building, there's a different sort of logistics because it's logistics across generations.
Absolutely.
Could you give us context? I mean, I think it's visual for a lot of people to say larger than the Great Pyramid in Giza. But how expansive was this plaza? Because we're talking about, when you said zoned living, it was like suburbs of a major city, a major metropolitan area. Across time, how much time does it take to build something like that? How many miles, or is it like Manhattan today? How big is this?
Yeah, it would have taken generations. I forget the exact acreage that it covered, but it was very significant acreage. But yeah, it would have taken 10s and 20 generations to build some of these structures. There's only Stone Age tools, so you're using sticks and stones and carrying basically buckets full of dirt to pile these things up. And on the size point too, one of the things that's really cool is genetic evidence shows approximately 1/3 of the inhabitants of Cahokia actively immigrated there from places west of the Rocky Mountains, along the Gulf of Mexico, and north of the Great Lakes. So people are actively immigrating there. There's no printing press saying, come to Cahokia, great opportunities, just word traveled, when people were going to trade and things like that.
Maybe I should have gotten out of the way early, so I'm going to reverse course for just a moment. Writers tend to care about words.
Yeah.
You've written here, you have nations right in the title for us. How are we to distinguish, and does it matter? In Canada, we talk about Native peoples, right? So we have different terms: Indigenous, Native American, Indian. What is it people should know prior to getting into the conversation about law and regulation? There's a language question.
Sure, yeah. On the language point, that's a never-ending source of debate in Indian country. What do you call Indians, for lack of a better term? I always use Indians because, if I'm talking about Indian law, and actually Title 25 of the U.S. Code is titled Indians. That's the name of the regulation. Lots of tribes use Indian, for example, Indians in their name. So, for example, Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, Southern Ute Indian Tribe, several others. And I guess in Louisiana, where I'm from, for example, we had Bobby Jindal as the governor, from India. So when he got elected governor, he had it changed from the Office of Indian Affairs to the Office of Native American Affairs. As soon as he left office, the tribes changed it back to Indian Affairs. So, there's no right answer. Different places use different things. But yeah, Indian's the legal terms, if anybody asks. That's why I always use the word Indian.
Okay. So how we talk about it, we talked about why you wrote. Who did you write for? You've mentioned a governor. You've mentioned, alluded to some of the different government interactions. Who do you hope reads this book?
Well, everybody, of course. But,
okay, so we'll pause right there and say, we're active promoters of capitalism. You should buy this book, not just read this book. And if you're inclined, buy 2 copies, one for a friend.
And Kent gave me the greatest endorsement when we were talking about this. He said it was actual beach reading.
I had it at the beach last week, Bethany Beach, for all of those who are about to ask.
But the audience I'm trying to target in general is it's a pretty broad net. So a lot of people that are interested in Indian affairs often take the position that Indians, are just living in harmony with nature prior to 1492, didn't trade, the noble savage, for lack of a better term. Then my message to those folks is, Indians are people. They respond to the same incentives as everyone else. They like nice things. For example, when the Dutch went to Manhattan, Indians started buying cookies, and the Dutch were upset because they were paying more for cookies than the Dutch were. So they were, Indians weren't like, oh no, it's a cookie, I can't eat it, I won't be an Indian anymore. They're like, no, cookies are delicious, I'm going to eat them all up. So there was none of that debate for, the original Indians. And I'd like to get that message across. Tribal cultures evolve just like all other cultures. And the other side is, my goal has always been to try to smuggle freedom back to the U.S. through the res. So I'm trying to get people on the political right and right of center to think about Indian tribes as opportunities to decrease regulations and create opportunities for everybody. So
you use a really interesting term there. It's come up a couple times in our conversations. You said the res, right? And it's this all-encompassing, I believe you mean it as an all-encompassing descriptor, not just a specific reservation. Just prior to that, you said something about smuggling and culture. American culture has had Indian culture since there's been American culture, right? Any time period that you pick, Today we have a prominent television series called The Res. There's the stories about children playing cowboys and Indians in the 1950s and the great nostalgia. The expanded frontier and the closing of the American frontier. Indian culture has always been part of our culture. What is it that is most important about Indian culture that you think is underappreciated broadly in American life?
Sure. I guess one of the big things is just the idea of liberty. A lot of people trace that to the Indian tribes. So whenever the colonists came over, Europe was governed by monarchs. Most of the Indian tribes, they had governments, but it wasn't like Europeans at all. There was a lot more laissez-faire. So lots of the colonies actually passed laws making it illegal to go live with the Indian tribes. So just think of it, if you're a Puritan, life's not so fun, right? You don't have food either. Whereas you go hang out with the tribes, they're a lot more laissez-faire and they've got food, you can trade and do all these things. So people actively were trying to immigrate to Indian tribes. And in fact, some of the people that got captured, actually they got ransomed. They tried to go back to the tribes because they enjoyed living with tribes more. Not that tribes never did bad things, but the idea of liberty, a lot of people think the roots of that come to the Indian tribes themselves. John Locke's writing about this around the same time too. So the idea of the, quote, noble savage got molded in shapes to fit whatever political ideas were available.
How did the Declaration of Independence treat the notion of Indian life and Indian rights and Americans who were here before? This is some 13 years before there was an America. We probably are all very familiar with that famous line about all men are created equal, but it's not the only place, a close study of the Declaration, where Indians show up. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, if you keep reading, you'll see Indian tribes, one of the reasons the colonies break away from Great Britain. They say King George has incited the murderous Indian savage to rise up against us. So Indian tribes are clearly on the Founding Fathers' mind when they're drafting this. And what that was about is after the French and Indian War, the colonists fought that to expand out west, and tribes weren't having this, so they were fighting back. So King George passed the Proclamation of 1763, which essentially said it was illegal to go west of the Appalachian Mountains, but settlers were doing that anyway, and tribes were fighting back. That's how you get Pontiac's Rebellion and things like that. As a result, tribes are fighting back, and they have the support of the other colonial powers. The Americans don't like that, and that's one of the things that helped sparks the American Revolution.
I want to stick with I'm going to rewind a little bit for the res for just a moment. The Declaration is getting a lot of attention. We're coming up on 249 years since that was signed, and so there's this broader national interest in what was going on with that period. Is the development of American government taught on the res in the way that, which I think would be great, in the way that you were describing? Indians had government pre-contact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that is not taught,
for sure,
or not taught well. At least that's the what I read in your book.
Yeah.
So is it a two-way street in that all of the kids are getting left out of something, or on the res do they get both parts of the history?
I would say it varies a lot from tribe to tribe. Schools on reservations aren't often well funded, and they struggle to get resources oftentimes. I'm not an expert on what's taught in all the schools across Indian country. It'd be tough to say, but I do think that's a good point you highlighted, though. Like whenever you're taking American history courses, Indian history usually stops at the Trail of Tears if you get that far, and they lived in teepees. This idea of Indians advancing with society is really hard for a lot of people to grasp because they've never seen an Indian in a business suit. That's one of the reasons the book covers like that. Indians can always be in the modern world. And I guess on that note, an example, we've got a Coushatta gentleman here is my dear friend and mentor, Ernest Sickey. Whenever he was going around, he always wore a business suit. He said he wanted to show Indians could participate in the modern world. Our cultures adapt and evolve just like anybody else. So,
throughout the book, there's a discussion of contemporary. I don't mean historical,
sure,
but right now, colonialism toward Indians and Indian life. Different treatment under the law.
Yes.
the same sort of colonialism that was the source of rebellion in 1776. Yeah. What is that word? Are you just grasping for something that's a big word that is fancy and people say, oh, I don't like colonialism, that's something that's taboo now? Or is there merit behind that word choice? Is there a lot of more that we should understand about how we are still today colonizing Indian life, Indian land, Indian property, etc.?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. Yeah, so the word colonialism has come up a lot more in recent years than in years past, but in Indian country, and I guess, yeah, so Indian country, it's defined by statute 18 U.S.C. 1151, all land within our reservations, but we just say the rest because it's fun and shorter than Indian country. But yeah, so the laws governing Indian country a lot of them still come from straight up 1790. So Indian trader laws are my favorite example. They were put on the books in 1790 because the federal government thought Indians were too incompetent to trade with white people. They're still on the books, 25 U.S.C. 261 through 264. And the laws actually say white people and full-blood Indian. That's colonial regulations. We wouldn't let that stand for any other racial group. And we still cite cases going back from 1823. Johnson v. McIntosh is still the foundation of Indian law.
So within the study of law and the practice of law,
yes.
Where this comes up in disputes, is there a tension with 20th century civil rights law?
Yeah.
How does that work out?
Sure. Yeah, that's a big tension. So some of the people who oppose tribal rights often say Indians get this special racial treatment for things. You often get the job, Indians, they have casinos, now everything's cool. When in fact that completely misses the mark. Tribes are governments. For opening a casino on the reservation is the same thing as Nevada choosing to allow casinos within its borders. It's just a sovereign choice. It's not reparations. Casinos are just a recognition of that sovereignty, even though that got rolled back after they had the right affirmed to do it. But on that point, so the reparations, yeah, it's completely separate. The equal treatment thing, too, it's often used to try to erode tribal sovereignty. Tribes have these special rights, and it's usually tied up in racial things. Like the Indian Child Welfare Act is a great one that's coming to the Supreme Court recently. Indians get these special treatment under the law. Well, no, tribes are just reaching out to adopt their enrolled citizens. So it's based upon the political classification, not the racial one.
Can you say that again? I think this is worth repeating. Tribes are a political
yes.
consideration, not a racial consideration.
Absolutely, yes.
And just one more time, sure. Unpack that for us.
Yeah, so that's what underpins all of Indian law. So that was challenged in 1975. So by way of background, federal Indian policy has undergone some drastic swings over the year, to put it mildly. And in 1970, we got what's known as the tribal self-determination era. President Nixon ushered that in, and Congress jumped fully on board in 1975. So as part of that, various federal agencies, most notably the Bureau of Indian Affairs, had a hiring preference for Indians, and the goal was to foster tribal self-government. So a non-Indian got passed over for a promotion, and he challenged it, saying it was racial discrimination under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, I think. And went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, Indian, as used in the statute, is not a racial classification at all. It's based upon your enrollment in a sovereign political body. And so that's what all of it comes down to, recognition as tribal sovereign. So an example would be, so my tribe, the United Homa Nation, the federal government has determined the Homa are, quote, Indian beyond doubt or question, but we're not a tribe of Indians.
So I descended from poor German factory workers and poor Irish failing farmers. Mm-hmm. If I were to move to a reservation, could I choose to be governed by tribal law? How would that work?
Well, right now the Supreme Court would say, no, you're not an Indian. And that's one of the things whenever the colonialism comes up, it goes back to basically these colonial ideas of tribes being savage and wanting to discriminate against non-Indians. If you read the cases, Oliphant, 1978 case, one of my favorites, Tribe Lose, is just completely wacky, some of the stuff the court says. But as the law currently stands, no, like legally you go on the reservation and you want to follow tribal law. Supreme Court says, no, you cannot consent to tribal law, you're not non-Indian. So you can just kind of do whatever you want, punch all the Indians, the tribe can't arrest you. And that's what the Supreme Court says is cool.
So it's the inverse would be true as well. The tribe could not punish me, mm-hmm. but the tribe cannot protect its own people and their property and their interests and their commerce and their future, whatever it is that would be an interest of a government.
100%.
Okay. That sounds to me like modern day colonialism. Do you get pushback from this among academics? Because it's a loaded, freighted word, right? It suggests something really, really bad, and here you are throwing it at the dominant political structure. How does that land?
Well, I would argue it is really, really bad.
Oh, okay.
But apart from that, no, I think most people are familiar with the history of federal Indian law. I mean, it's really hard to argue it's anything but. The Supreme Court, like I said, is still citing precedent explicitly from 1823. And one of the fun things about it is the Solicitor General, and I think I guess I'm getting old, it was like 2010 or something, 15 years ago now, at a federal bar conference.
Sure, you're ancient.
At a federal bar conference, the Solicitor General's office actually issued an apology saying a lot of the cases the Supreme Court decided, the Solicitor General completely made up the factual assertions in its brief. And the Supreme Court continues to rely on those cases. So I guess a good one would be U.S. v. Sandoval. It's early 1900s case. And the issue in the case is, are the Pueblo Indians Indians? And we have this big problem because, Indians are these wandering savages and Pueblos live in stone houses and farms. So are they Indians? Supreme Court decides the Pueblo people are Indians because, quote, they are a simple, uninformed, and inferior people. That's the law to this day. It was actually cited in 2020 to support the tribes. That gives you some of an idea how bad federal Indian law is.
I want to ask about federalism, but I'm going to sneak another question in here for just a moment. We have just talked about casually something that I'm not sure that is widely understood. So could you unpack for us for a moment legal jurisdictions, right? Courts. You're referring to federal law and federal precedent. Earlier, we had a little bit of an exchange about what would happen, who enforces the law on the reservation. So what courts, what magistrates, who's in charge of these questions about judging if an harm has been done and what the punishment would be, or innocence and guilt and things like that? How does that work in our legal system in the United States of America vis-a-vis Indian nations?
Well, the short answer would be it doesn't work. But it's really complicated, and it's dependent on the question of, are the people Indian or not? And that goes back to an 1820.
Which people? The people who have done the harm? Involved in the event. Okay.
Yes, sir. So, for example, so non-Indian punches an Indian on the reservation. The tribe can't arrest him. The state can't arrest him unless you're in Oklahoma. And then, so only the federal government can come and arrest him. And then you have to figure out who is an Indian. Different federal courts use different tests to determine whether or not a person is an Indian. So you're going to have to figure out whether somebody qualifies as an Indian, which is a whole adventure in federal court. So there's literally asking up things like, does this person go to powwow dances? Do they practice Indian religion? And federal courts look at things like this to determine whether a person is an Indian.
In the book publishing world, you have something of a special designation that you earned a blurb from a sitting United States senator about on a book about law. You mentioned Oklahoma.
Yes.
Why is it that things would be different in Oklahoma than other places? And I reference that because
Sure.
I believe Senator Mark Wayne Mullen is of Oklahoma, and he's an Indian.
That's correct. Yes, sir. So things are different in Oklahoma because we had the 2020 Supreme Court decision in McGirt, which some guys in this room might remember. So basically what happened in that case is the facts are bad. So Jim C. McGirt molested a kid. Everybody agrees he's guilty of sin. The state of Oklahoma prosecuted him. But he had a crafty attorney. And on appeal, the attorney argued Jim C. McGirt is an Indian, enrolled citizen of the Creek Nation, and he committed the crime against an Indian. And according to one of the Creek treaties, the reservation is where the crime was committed. All this, what we call Tulsa, is a reservation. And they filed it up on appeal, and the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed, and it went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the court split 5-4, and Justice Gorsuch famously wrote the majority opinion that said the Creek Reservation has never been disestablished. And to do that, basically they just followed the precedent that was from 2016 and going farther back. Only Congress can disestablish a reservation. And to do that, Congress has to clearly say the reservation no longer exists. That was something Oklahoma didn't even say. They said, no, Congress never did it. We would pile up all the anti-Indian laws ever passed by Congress and the reservation disappears. Justice Gorsuch said you couldn't do that with any other group of people. You can't do that with Indians either. So that was the decision. And following that, to put it mildly, Oklahoma lost its mind. They filed 45 cert petitions to have it overturned in a 2-year span, and all of them were declined. But the court did grant one to answer the question: can Oklahoma prosecute crimes committed by a non-Indian against an Indian on a reservation? And the answer was obviously no. We know that because Governor Stitt actually wrote that on his website. If a non-Indian commits a crime by or against an Indian, we don't have jurisdiction. And in fact, in Oklahoma's brief the year before, it wrote, we don't have jurisdiction if it's a reservation. But now they magically decided they always had this jurisdiction. And what happened is Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed. It was a 5-4 decision. Coney Barrett took her place, and she sided with the dissenters in McGirt, and that's what changed the outcome in Castro Huerta versus Oklahoma versus McGirt. That was really the only difference. And for what it's worth, Justice Ginsburg was not exactly a big tribal advocate. She wrote some of the most infamous opinions in Indian law history, most notably City of Sherrill v. Oneida Indian Nation, which says tribes lost their land by virtue of conquest and discovery. Footnote 1, City of Sherrill v. Oneida Indian Nation. So she was not exactly a big tribal proponent. But so that's why things are different in Oklahoma. Basically, the Supreme Court just decided to make up something in 2022 that never applied to reservations.
Okay. In other areas of law, we often celebrate that we have this diversity, right? The law in New Hampshire for what you're allowed to do or not allowed to do or be tracked down about from the state officers is quite different than in California. Mm-hmm. So this is celebrated. Justice Brandeis famously called it laboratories of democracy. Mm-hmm. Our federal structure has both horizontal and vertical federalism. Familiar to all. Briefly, vertically, we start with the individual, we move to local government, we have state government, and then the national government we call the federal government. Horizontally, we tend to organize around the separation of powers, so different branches of government. You have a discussion of federalism here in the book. I did not mention it when I gave that brief tutorial. Where does federalism fit for Indian law and the status quo and where we should be headed?
Yeah, so under the status quo, that's one of the interesting things. So in the 1970s, whenever tribes were getting more recognition by Congress and the executive branch as separate sovereigns, and the Supreme Court was pushing towards a broader states' rights jurisprudence, it pushed hard against tribal rights. So basically since 1970, the Supreme Court has been pushing against tribes participating in the federal system while elevating states.
So I understand that there are tribes in every corner of this continent. They're not all going to be alike. But generally speaking, do tribal governments work or interact more with the federal government or with their corresponding state government?
Yeah, like you said, each one's different, so it's tough to say. So like in South Dakota, the relationship was very bad, famously during COVID. Governor Noem was banned from all the reservations in the state, so they weren't working too closely with the state at that time, whereas in Louisiana, the tribes generally get along with the state quite well. So, for example, like state police are cross-deputized on all the reservations in the state, so yeah, so it varies a lot from state to state. But I think generally speaking, tribes would rather work with the feds because it's more of recognition of their sovereigns, and that's who the treaties are with. Treaties are with the federal government, not the state.
Could you just extend a little bit the federalism? How do you believe we should start understanding federalism going forward to incorporate your recommendations in the book here?
Yeah, so basically, federalism is good, I think most people agree with that, then let's extend it to Indian tribes. They're separate sovereigns. So, for example, in my home state of Louisiana, we have lots of really dopey laws. My favorite is you cannot legally sell flowers in Louisiana without a license. You can sell a gun without a license, but heaven forbid you sell flowers without a license. That law came into the books because one of the senator's wives was a florist and she didn't want competition. Like, that's the straight up reason for it. Only state in the country where you need a license to sell flowers. So what if you go to, say, the Coushatta Res and sell flowers? You know, do you need to get Louisiana's license? You know, so I think tribes can be escape valves for a lot of the state protectionism.
And that's where you're going to be smuggling freedom
Exactly.
back into life.
So I guess most recent, I guess before Tesla started getting firebombed, was Tesla was opening on the res. So lots of states have protectionist laws that say car dealers, you know, you have to have a license from the state, and there's a set number of license. So basically, it gives the car dealers a monopoly, and it's great for car dealers, but it costs average American, you know, what, $8,000 or $10,000 more per car. Nobody benefits but the car dealers. Pretty much everybody would agree with that. But the car dealers have a lot of power for lobbying and whatnot, so they have these laws on the books, even though they can't show any benefit. So in New Mexico, people wanted to buy Teslas, and they did. You just go to Colorado, Arizona, some other state, and you drive it in. Nobody's hurt. Everything's cool. But Tesla couldn't get the law changed in New Mexico. So what they did was they partnered with Nambe Pueblo. They opened up a Tesla dealership. And now New Mexicans just go to Nambe Pueblo instead of Utah or Arizona to get the Tesla. Nothing's changed. Same exact, you know, cars are on the road either way. Nobody's hurt except the car dealers, you know. So that's kind of my idea for it. You know, states won't make the policy change. Tribes have this opportunity to compete and make a better policy.
So competition naturally leads us to the part of the conversation where I sneak in the discussion about entrepreneurialism. What does the state of the entrepreneur look like? How does one start up or grow a business on the res?
Yeah, so that's a great point. So it's really tough to put it mildly.
It's tough everywhere, but what is different?
Sure, yeah. So what's different is, to get back to the word, the colonial regulations that are still in place. So, land in Indian country, it's owned by the federal government. It's not owned by the tribe. So the federal government holds the land in trust for the beneficial use of the tribe or individual Indians.
Let's pause.
Sure.
I knew that because I read the book.
Okay.
But can you say that slowly?
Sure.
The federal government owns the land.
Yes.
What's the rest of that sentence? This to me is really important.
Yeah. So the federal government holds the underlying title to all reservation lands, and for individual Indians or the tribe, they merely have beneficial use rights, even though it's their land. So if you want to do something on the land, you can't just do it. You have to get the federal government's permission, as you guys can imagine. I guess we're in CEI, so I don't have to make the argument that that's not very efficient.
So this would be the equivalent of I live across the river here in Virginia. The federal government owns the place where my house sits as a proxy for the tribe, which would in this case be the corollary to the government that is in Richmond. Where does the individual or the family or the household come into this?
Yeah, so you have to get the federal government's permission to, get this, little plot of land leased or whatever. Then you have to get the federal government to approve the construction and all of this and try to get a mortgage on land the bank can't repossess. It's pretty difficult. So that's why you see so many mobile homes on reservations.
Just a week ago, we had a forum with one of our financial regulators, federal financial regulators. Kyle Houtman is the head regulator at the Credit Unions Administration. And one of his crowning moments in his term was getting a new charter approved for Indian credit unions, right? What other kind of businesses do we see on Indian land or among these nations?
Yeah, so unfortunately, the way the system is structured right now, it's really hard to start a business. It's probably not worth your time and effort to start a barbershop, something I obviously desperately need, but or any other small business, because you're not going to make the huge profits. So that's one of the reasons you see casinos is a big thing, because you're going to make a lot of profit. So it's worth the time to jump through all the hoops and spend the years waiting, because it's probably going to be profitable. Same thing with oil and gas or something like that. If you're not going to make a lot of money, it's probably not worth the time and effort to jump through the 4 years of waiting period, 50 federal agencies to just get a permit to do business. And apart from the regulatory structure, you also have the issue of states under current Supreme Court precedent can tax reservation economic development. So this means if the state taxes and the tribe also taxes, now you have double taxed on the reservation versus one tax off reservation. So who's going to shop on the res when you're taxed twice, when you just go off reservation and pay one tax? But the flip side of the coin is if the tribe doesn't tax, how is this going to fund roads, bridges, police, and things like that? So tribes are in a real catch-22.
I think there's not universal, but widespread appreciation that many of the hurdles and the precedents were put in place with malice, right? They were racist. They were, you have something, we want it. You have land, we want it, whatever the thing was. Today, is the problem with the law and the legal system primarily one of malice or of ignorance?
Yeah, right now I'd say it's primarily ignorance. And a lot of people are just not wanting to revisit some of the basic questions. You know, like I was saying earlier, we're still citing cases from 1823 that describe Indians as fierce savages, you know. That's still cited all the time. Or, you know, one of my favorites, Ex parte Crow Dog. It's actually a victory for tribes, but the Supreme Court describes whites as the superiors of a different race, you know. And, you know, that's actually a win for tribes. Justice Gorsuch cited that to support tribes in 2020.
You've mentioned a couple of times Justice Gorsuch. We talked a little bit about Justice Bader Ginsburg. I think garnering a great deal of attention. Secretary of the Interior, for the first time ever, responsible for the regulation of not only commerce but land. Under President Biden was an Indian, and I'm
Deb Haaland?
Deb Haaland, thank you, because 30 minutes ago I knew her name and I just blanked out. How important are individual leaders versus, we've also talked about a couple of governors here, Governor Stitt and Jindal. Individual leaders versus sort of I don't see evidence of any sort of mass movement toward we're going to get right with Indian law in America.
Sure. That's what the book is for, yes.
That's what the book is for. We're going to engender that movement. But vis-a-vis those two, which one is more important right now for the state of the law to change? Do we need more prominent individuals, or is it more important to get broad-based support?
I would say it's probably broad-based support, because I think the bar is so low on that front. You know, just people, if they started seeing tribes as governments, I think that would solve a lot of the problems. Because even many of these issues to this day, when tribes try to do something economically, there's often the pushback, you know, oh, it's just another give out to the Indian tribes. Like, no, it's just a choice the tribe has made to do this on its land. So if we saw tribes as governments, I think that would help correct some things.
Is part of that a discomfort, do you think, with we don't want to allow someone to do something that we think is a mistake? You know, I see very otherwise conservative governors come in and look at the state of California and say we ought to nationalize that question, right? We ought to put that in federal law instead of state law, because they don't like the way California chooses to govern itself,
right?
And vice versa. You know, there's this flip-flop effect depending on who's in charge. Sure. Is that the same sort of phenomena here? People just aren't ready to tolerate that some people in some places will live differently than they choose to live?
Yeah, that's probably a good way to put it, yeah.
Okay. You've touched on it in a couple different points, but what is it about the regulatory state that is especially pernicious on the res or for Indian nations? I find it to be a horrendous artifact of our contemporary life for everyone, but in reading this, I got the sense of like, oh, it's way worse. Everything's way worse. Yeah. So what is it that is way worse about the regulatory state and the way the regulatory apparatus and the process works for Indians?
Yeah, sure. So one of the key things is that since the land's held in trust and tribes are, quote, domestic dependent nations, the federal government is looking out for the good of Indians with all its regulations. So, for example, on the Bureau of Indian Affairs website, you know, talking about NEPA, it says that we'll waive this unless you're an Indian country. Then it's not getting waived. We're going to go through the whole process. I forget if it's the I always get them backed up. The environmental impact assessment, according to the GIO, takes on average 6 months to complete and $300,000 cost, whereas a full environmental impact statement takes 4.6 years and $4.6 million. So basically, you just skip that by going off the res.
And that's the preparation of the document that you turn in. It's not even the review of the document, which will then take an additional several years. Adam, I want to go out and give you the last word before I promote our next event. So what is it that you want people to walk out of this building knowing?
What I'd like people to walk out this building knowing is that tribes are governments, and they want the same thing as every other government. They want their people to be safe and have economic opportunities. And if we let tribes participate in the federal system, everybody will benefit.
That is good news to go out on. Please help us spread the word, and I look forward to seeing you all on September 18th for the Julian L. Simon Award Dinner, which will be held at the Organization of American States. More information on that event is on our website this year. Our Simon awardee is Professor Jim Otteson of Notre Dame, and we'll be joined with a keynote presentation by Hernando de Soto. Thank you all very much, and we look forward to seeing you next time.